So I'll be recording the meeting and posting it onto our website, hopefully tomorrow. So if there are people within the community that you're representing, if they're not able to attend the meeting, we will have the recording and the slideshow up on our website. So I'll get started here. Thanks for joining us this evening. I see a lot of familiar faces, so thank you for logging in on this warm summer evening. This is the Act 181 workshop for municipal officials. I think you all know me, but my name is Matt Bachler. I'm a senior planner at Wyndham Regional Commission. And I'm excited to be connecting with you all tonight, just to talk about this important legislation. We're going to be covering major changes in the Act 181 process and start to review the new regional land use mapping process that we're just getting started on here at Wyndham Regional. I just want to note this evening, this is really meant as an overview of Act 181 and the changes in that legislation. As I'll be talking about during the presentation, Wyndham Regional is going to be doing much more in-depth planning with each of our towns beginning in the fall of 2025 on the implementation process for updating our regional plan and addressing the new regional land use map requirements, but this is an opportunity to just provide an overview and kind of an introduction to the larger project that we'll be working on. So to give you a sense of what we'll be covering, so we have a lot to cover tonight, including some context on how we got here, what changes are in place today, things that have already gone into effect with Act 181, the changes made to the regional land use mapping requirements, where housing targets fit in, changes to the State Designation Program and the Act 250 jurisdiction, and then our process at Wyndham Regional for implementing these changes and collaborating with our towns. There are some areas in Act 181 that we're not going to be focusing on tonight, just to let you know. So there were some additional municipal zoning preemptions included in Act 181. A lot of these were some technical fixes to preemptions included in the Home Act. So we won't be going over those, and then we're not going to get into a lot of details about the State Land Use Review Board rulemaking process, but I will let you know where you can get information about the State Land Use Review Board, their rulemaking process, if that's something you're interested in learning more about. I'm going to be giving regular prompts during the presentation for questions, just because we are going over a lot of content, so I'll break it up and give us all an opportunity to ask questions. So if you can, try to hold questions until there's a prompt for questions. If you have something that you want to put in the chat box, feel free to do that. And then we can look at those questions in the chat box. I'm going to just have my video off while I'm presenting, but when we get to questions, I'll turn my video back on. One last thing I wanted to mention before getting started. I think as many of you know, Wyndham Regional Commission has been working on a regional plan update that began several years before Act 181 was passed in 2024. And we are moving ahead with the adoption of that regional plan update, and that's scheduled to happen later in July of this summer. And so that regional plan update is not addressing all the Act 181 changes, but because we had started that project well before these changes went into effect, we wanted to wrap that up before moving on to the Act 181 regional plan update. So you will be hearing from us about the regional plan update that's going to be adopted in July, but just to distinguish between that and this Act 181 process. So with that, I'll get started. So what is Act 181? Act 181 makes major changes to land use planning and regulatory framework, including a new consistent framework for regional future land use maps across the whole state. So there are 11 regional planning commissions in Vermont, including WRC. And so Act 181 establishes a consistent framework for all 11 RPCs in developing their future land use maps. It reorganizes the State Designation Program that makes a connection between that program and regional land use planning. And there's the overhaul of Act 250 jurisdiction, and that's also tied to regional land use planning. The overarching goal behind these changes is trying to strengthen place-based regulatory jurisdiction and investments in those areas that can support more growth. The old system under Act 250 was largely based on the size of a project. And we'll get into a little more information about Act 250 shortly here. It ensures that Act 250 and the investments that are made in state designated areas are guided by a regional and local land use planning process so that it's more informed by local level decision making. Finally, as I mentioned too, there were some technical changes to local zoning preemption that were originally made in the Home Act of 2023. That was also included in this legislation. The changes made in Act 181, there's been a lot of work that went into the legislation in Act 181. So it's been many years coming. There was significant input and collaboration from various state, regional, and local organizations that all went the final version of the legislation. So I'm going to go over some of those just briefly here because I think it's helpful to understand all the work that was done leading up to this legislation. So there were three main studies that directly shaped Act 181. And there was also some extra impetus for getting Act 181 done to respond to the housing crisis that we're facing statewide, the need for more housing. And in response to the more frequent and intense flooding events that have occurred in the state recently. So the first major study that was done was the Natural Resources Board completed a study regarding updates to Act 250. This was completed in December of 2023. And that study had three recommendations. One, to switch from the size-based jurisdiction model under Act 250 to a location-based jurisdiction model. So tying Act 250 requirements to where the project's happening within the state versus the size of the project. The second recommendation from the NRB study was to make the Natural Resources Board, which is the board responsible for reviewing Act 250 permits, making that a professional board as opposed to a volunteer board that are appointed officials. So that board has more expertise and dedication to taking a more active role in rulemaking and policy development and overseeing the whole process. And then the third recommendation from that study was implementing a statewide future land use mapping process implemented by regional planning commissions in consultation with their municipalities. The second important study that led or influenced Act 181 was the Designation 2050 study. This was authorized by the Home Act in 2023, and it had the intent of evaluating and proposing reforms to the state's designation program. One of the key recommendations was to simplify the structure of the designation program. So the designation program has grown to 5 different designations over time, and many of those have a high bar of entry. So it's difficult for municipalities to take advantage of those some of those different designations. And then the final report was a regional planning report prepared by the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, or VAPTA. This was also a requirement under the Home Act. The report was required to make statutory recommendations to better integrate and implement municipal, regional, and state plans and investments by focusing on regional future land use maps and policies. And so the report recommended a framework for consistent regional future land use maps that are connected to Act 250 jurisdiction and to state designations. So all 3 of those studies had many similar ideas for how to bring planning systems together into a new land use planning framework. And that's what got implemented in the final Act 181 legislation. So this is just showing some of the different inputs into this new central framework for land use planning and regulation in Vermont. So first, Act 181 directs the regional planning commissions to create new regional plans with consistent future land use maps. Prior to this, all regional planning commissions were developing regional plans and future land use maps, but we had different land use categories from RPC to RPC, and we mapped them in different ways. So there was inconsistency across RPCs. So that consistent mapping process will allow us to kind of stitch all the different regional maps together to create a statewide planning framework. Second, this process of updating regional plans and future land use maps is being done in collaboration with municipalities, so direct input from towns on how those future land use maps look, how districts are located within a community. The third component, this is the State Designation Program, has been reformed and reduced to 2 designations from 5. And I'll be going into all of this in more detail, but this is just an overview of the changes. The downtown board no longer approves designations. Current and new state designated areas will be integrated into the regional future land use maps. And there is a new community investment board that's going to be approving incentives and benefits for those designated areas. And then the fourth component is Act 250 has been converted to a place-based jurisdiction administered by the new Land Use Review Board. The Land Use Review Board will review and approve all regional plans as well, including our new future land use map, new state designations, and requests for Tier 1A and Tier 1B status under Act 250. So this graphic helps illustrate the new framework, and I'll walk you through it here because there's a lot of information. But I think this helps kind of show how all these different components are interconnected and related. So first, up here are the regional plan future land use categories. So that's downtown centers, village centers, planned growth area, village area, transition, enterprise, resource-based recreation, and then there's a rural category that includes hamlets, rural general, rural agriculture and forest, and rural conservation. So that's the first layer is mapping out these new regional future land use categories. Below that, we're looking at the State Designation Program being managed by the Community Investment Board. So if an area is mapped as a downtown center or a village center on the future land use map, it will automatically become what is now known as a center. So with the shift from 5 designations to 2 designations, we now have centers and neighborhoods. Those are the 2 possible designations under the new program. So downtown and village centers automatically become centers. A planned growth area or a village area becomes a designated neighborhood under that new program. Also, all existing designations are maintained. So if your town has a village center, a designated downtown, or a neighborhood development area, all those will carry over into this new framework. So there's nothing that a town needs to do if it already has that. And then underneath this, under the state designation section here, is the Act 250 jurisdiction. And again, this is connected to the regional future land use map based on 3 different tiers. So tier 2 is just the status quo. It's essentially the same existing size-based jurisdiction system. Areas that are mapped as downtown and village centers or planned growth areas, those become eligible for what's known as Tier 1A, and that is full exemption from permitting under Act 250. Municipalities that are eligible for Tier 1A also have to meet some other standards that we'll cover in the upcoming slides. So it's not just the regional future land use map that determines that eligibility. There are other criteria. And similarly, for Tier 1B, that include, so if you're within an area that's mapped as a downtown or village center or planned growth area or village area, those areas are also eligible for Tier 1B. So the only difference with Tier 1B and Tier 1A eligibility is village areas are not eligible for Tier 1A. Tier 1B is a partial exemption from Act 250, so it doesn't exempt all projects. It just exempts housing projects that are up to 50 units on 10 acres or less of land. And for Tier 1A, that requires a separate application process too, that the town initiates with the Land Use Review Board. For Tier 1B, that process is, as we're working with towns on the regional future land use map, if a town wants to qualify for that Tier 1B status, that's something that we include in our regional plan. And then once the regional plan is approved, they have that Tier 1B status, so it's not a separate application process. I want to note too, there is a Tier 3, which is for critical natural resource areas. Tier 3 is subject to rulemaking that's being done by the Land Use Review Board. So it's not derived from the regional land use map. A question I've gotten in the past, if there's a connection between rural conservation and what will be Tier 3, but there is not. So just, I want to make very clear that for Tier 3, that's a separate rulemaking process that the Land Use Review Board is working on currently. So I've talked a little bit about, I've mentioned some new boards that were created under Act 181, and I just wanted to take a second just to clarify what those 2 new boards are, just because they'll come up a lot in this presentation. First, the the Natural Resources Board that formerly administered Act 250 has been changed from a volunteer board to a 5-member full-time professional board, the Land Use Review Board. And so that Land Use Review Board was formed earlier this year, and they've begun working on developing a lot of the rulemaking for Tier 3 and working on the Tier 1A application process and how they're going to be reviewing regional plans. There's a lot of just administrative rulemaking work they need to do, being an entirely new board. So in addition to administering Act 250, they also have the responsibility of approving regional plans and future land use maps. Previously, the Natural Resources Board was just responsible for Act 250 and not approval of regional plans. So that's a new requirement for regional planning commissions, is to receive that approval from a state board. Second is the Community Investment Board. So this is replacing the Downtown Board, which previously was responsible for approving state designations and tax credits. So the CIB will no longer be approving state designations, this as of October of 2025. So the state designations will be approved through the regional future land use map, but this Community Investment Board will continue to review applications for tax credits within those approved designated areas. So before I look into these changes more, I just want to briefly go over what's in effect today, starting with the existing framework for Act 250, and then there were some exemptions for housing projects, temporary exemptions from Act 250 that have been in effect since July of 2024. So I think we're all familiar with Act 250, but just briefly, it's the state land use and development law. It was enacted in 1970 at a time when we were seeing a lot more development pressure in the state. And there was a desire to protect Vermont's rural character. So trying to preserve our historic villages and downtowns and protecting rural countryside around those areas. And Act 250's had a lot of success in maintaining that character of Vermont over the last several decades. But there has been a recognition that reform was needed to Act 250. Concerns around added cost and time for development, appeals process, and then in areas where you have very strong municipal land use regulations, there's a lot of duplication between what's required under Act 250 and what's required in a local land use planning process. Aside from the exemptions for housing projects and towns that have zoning and subdivision regulations, an Act 250 permit is required for commercial projects greater than 10 acres, for 10 housing units or more, for a 10-lot subdivision, and for resource extraction. For towns that don't have zoning and subdivision, there's a lower threshold for when an Act 250 permit is required. And Act 250 applications were reviewed by the District Environmental Commission in a public quasi-judicial process. It's similar to your local DRB or Planning Commission review of a development application. And there are 10 criteria that are addressed in that Act 250 review process, looking at concerns around environment, quality of life, and then the unique character of Vermont's communities. So just I briefly want to go over some of the interim exemptions. So these are separate from the permanent exemptions that are available to towns under Act 181 through Tier 1A and Tier 1B. But there was a recognition that it was going to take several years to fully implement Act 181. And so these interim housing exemptions were put in. with Act 181 in 2024 to try to encourage housing in particular during this interim period while we work on updating regional plans. So there are location-based and type-based exemptions. So for location-based, priority housing projects, and a priority housing project is a mixed income, can be mixed use residential project, but at least 20% of the units need to be affordable. So priority housing projects are exempt within designated downtowns and neighborhood development areas, including a half-mile buffer around those areas. All housing projects, regardless of size, are exempt in a designated downtown, as long as some other criteria are met, including towns having zoning and subdivision regulations. For neighborhood development areas, that exemption is for 75 units or less, and then for village center and a quarter-mile buffer, it's 50 units or less. And then for type-based, a commercial project converting to housing up to 29 units is exempt, accessory dwelling units are exempt, and then hotel and motel conversions to affordable housing units are also exempt from Act 250. So as I mentioned, to be eligible, in addition to having zoning and subdivision, there needs to be municipal sewer or water or soils that are adequate for wastewater disposal. And I'll just show you just a map. This is an interim. The state has created a map showing these areas that are eligible for interim exemptions. This is what the map looks like in kind of the main downtown Brattleboro, West Brattleboro area. This is intended as a planning tool, so we recommend getting jurisdictional opinion from the state if there's a question about eligibility. But you'll see where my cursor is on the screen. This is Brattleboro's designated downtown. This lighter pink around the downtown area is their neighborhood development area. In this even lighter shade of pink, this is showing the half-mile buffer from their neighborhood development area and designated downtown. So in West Brattleboro, they also have a neighborhood development area. So all these areas that fall within this lighter shade of pink would be eligible for those interim exemptions under Act 250. And again, this map is available on online if anyone was interested in looking at that. So I'm going to pause and just to see if there are questions. I see a question from Jessica. So Jessica asked if the CIB replacing the downtown board doesn't approve state designations. Oh, who does? Okay. Jessica, it sounds like I answered your question.
Yeah, kind of. Is that the LURB then, or who determines who decides it, I guess? Who decides the map that then decides that? Who's the governing body there?
So that's right. It's the LURB, the Land Use Review Board, that's approving the regional land use map. That through the regional land use map, that's how you qualify for those designations. There is a process where WRC has to submit our draft map to the Land Use Review Board and provide them with 60 days to review and comment on that. And part of that process is the CIB will review what we're proposing for those designated areas and comment on that. So in that review process, there may be comments on the extent and boundaries of what would be designated centers or neighborhoods.
Okay, thanks.
Today it's the Land Use Review Board that's approving the regional map, and once that gets approved, then the designations go into effect. Does that Make
Yes,
sense?
that answers it. Thanks.
Sure. Um, any other questions at this point? If not, I'll continue. But yeah, feel free to use the chat box if you have anything that comes up. Um, let's see. So, next I'm going to talk about with a specific requirements in Act 181 for our regional plan. Um, so for regional planning goals, the first item on the screen here, and I'll be going into housing targets more in a couple of slides here, but we're directed to accommodate a substantial majority of housing needs for the region within areas planned for growth. So those are the centers, planned growth areas, and village areas primarily. A new regional planning goal is to equitably distribute environmental benefits and burdens across the region. So that's something we need to demonstrate in our regional plan. For regional planning process, like the process we go through in doing our regional plan, there was some additional language added to statute strengthening the requirements for engagement in regional planning. So we need to provide engagement opportunities for meaningful participation from member towns and the public. This is something that's already required for regional plans and something we already do, but the statute language was just strengthened in this area. And then there were some changes to the regional plan elements. There were some minor changes to what we need to address in terms of natural resources in our plan. But the big change, as I've talked about, is the new 10 consistent land use categories under our land use element. To give you a sense of our timeline for updating the regional plan to meet all these new requirements, we're aiming to update our plan by the fall of 2026. Under statute, we need to have an updated plan by December 31st of 2026. Right now, we're in phase one off on the left-hand side here. We're in the preparation background planning phase of this project. As I mentioned, we're in the process of wrapping up a regional plan update that began several years ago. And after that's completed, we're going to have more time to be focused on the Act 181 changes. Phase two is our main town engagement and future land use map drafting phase. So this will begin fall of 2025. And we're expecting it to run through winter of 2026. We recognize that each town is going to want to take a different approach with working with WRC on reviewing draft future land use maps, commenting on those. In some communities, a select board might want to take more of a role in that. In some communities, it might be more of the planning commission takes a lead role. So we're going to work with each town to figure out what makes sense for them to review this revised future land use map. When we reach out to towns in the fall, we're going to be providing a draft of the future land use map based on the statute requirements from Act 181. But the idea is to work with towns to refine that. This is just kind of a first draft that we'll be working on. And we'll also be providing detailed information to towns about what all of it means, kind of what the implications are if you're in land use category X versus land use category Y, just so there's an understanding about what all this means. Following that process of working with our towns, we'll pull together a complete draft regional plan in the spring and summer of 2026. And as I said, looking to submit that to the Land Use Review Board for approval in the fall. So next, I'm going to talk more about the consistent future land use categories that were created in Act 181. So those are listed out on the screen here, those 10 land use categories. I do want to say the Wyndham Regional Commission, we've had a regional plan since our inception as a regional planning commission, and we've had a regional proposed land use map going back for decades. And there are many similarities between these new land use categories developed under Act 181 and the land use categories we already use in our regional plan. So for those that are familiar with our regional plan, who have seen our proposed land use map, you'll see there's the categories we have already. There's a lot of similarities between what was developed in Act 181. And RPCs were involved in the process of developing Act 181. So we were able to provide a lot of input in what those categories should be and the requirements for the different categories. We also, following the adoption of Act 181, RPCs worked together to develop a methodology for how we're going to map out these areas. So there are requirements in statute for these different land use districts, but then there's also other mapping considerations. And so in that methodology we developed, the goal was to have a consistent mapping process so that all RPCs are mapping these future land use areas out in a similar way. So I'm going to go through each of these just to provide some more details about the different land use categories. So for downtown centers and village centers, these are vibrant mixed-use centers that bring together community and economic activity and civic assets. They include all existing village centers, and designated downtowns automatically become a village center or a downtown center. Downtowns and village centers they're really the central business and civic centers, so they're not necessarily the entirety of a downtown area, but it's really kind of the core Main Street area and areas immediately surrounding that. Often adjacent to a downtown or village center is a planned growth area or village area, which covers kind of the surrounding neighborhoods around a center. Under statute too, it also provides for opportunities for downtown and village centers to grow in a flood resilient way. So we are allowed to expand the boundaries of a downtown center or village center to make sure that there's adequate land for growth outside of areas that are more at risk for flooding. Recognizing that's a growing concern for a lot of communities. There are more specific criteria and requirements for a downtown center than a village center. So village centers do not have a requirement for having a municipal plan, zoning, subdivision, or infrastructure. So towns that don't have that in place are still eligible for that village center designation, which is important because that also allows them to qualify for the designation under the Community Investment Board. Planned growth areas, I began to talk about those. These are our densest existing settlement and future growth areas that are adjacent to downtowns or village centers. It's areas you have the highest concentration of population, housing, employment in each region and town. These areas include commercial, residential, civic, and cultural sites, have active streetscapes. Again, adjacent to downtowns and village centers, and they provide opportunities for communities to grow in a flood resilient way. So there's also that goal within the legislation to identify safer areas for growth. There are requirements for zoning and subdivision for a planned growth area, and then either public water or wastewater. And then towns also need to have implemented kind of complete streets principles, so providing for sidewalks, bicycle accommodation, things like that within a planned growth area. The village area is similar in some ways to a planned growth area, but it does assume more moderate to lower density type of development as compared to the planned growth area. So these are traditional settlement areas. It can also be a proposed new settlement area that is in proximity to a village center or downtown center. Again, there's a mix of residential, civic, religious, commercial, and mixed-use buildings, usually arranged along a main street and intersecting streets that are within walking distance with that core village center or downtown center. Village areas provide some opportunity for infill development and or new development areas where a village can grow in a flood resilient way. So for a village area, it's also required that the town have zoning and subdivision bylaws. But for infrastructure, it's public water or sewer, or a town can just demonstrate they have suitable soils for a wastewater system. And the wastewater system doesn't necessarily, or the suitable soils can be kind of just outside of the village area, as long as it's in close proximity to the village area. Transition and infill areas. Not every community will have a area that's mapped as transition / infill. So these are areas of existing or planned. So it can be a kind of a future area that a town is planning for. Commercial, office, mixed use development, or residential uses, with the idea that it's adjacent to a planned growth or village area, or it can be a new standalone transition area. The intent behind this land use category, it's to transform it. One of the main intents is to try to transform existing commercial strip development into higher density mixed use settlements, or residential neighborhoods through infill and redevelopment. But it can also include adjacent greenfield sites, again, that are safe from flooding and planned for future growth. These areas, they need to be served by water or wastewater, or the town needs to have plans for providing water or wastewater. And there is a specific requirement in statute that commercial linear strip development is not allowed within these areas. So the intent behind this is to try to transform some of our more sprawling commercial development into more mixed use, higher density type developments. Enterprise areas. These are locations of high economic activity and employment, such as an industrial park or resource extraction. They're separate from the economic activity and employment you would find in a center or planned growth area. So these are more standalone industrial parks that might be on the outskirts of a town, or a large scale resource extraction site in a more rural setting might qualify as an enterprise area. This is also, not every town will have enterprise areas. Resource-based recreation areas, in our area, our region, this will largely be our ski resorts, so Stratton, Mount Snow, Magic Mountain, but it also could apply to other resource-based recreational facilities that might not be around a ski resort. So these areas provide for infrastructure, jobs, and housing to support those recreational activities. Hamlets, these are small historic clusters of homes. They don't need to provide public water or wastewater systems, and we are able to just depict them as points on the map. These might be settlement areas that don't qualify for village center, or if a town would prefer to remain to be a hamlet, not identified as a village center, that may qualify as a hamlet. And then finally, I'll talk about the three rural categories. That's general, agricultural, and forestry and conservation. So the rural general, this is from statute. These are areas that promote the preservation of Vermont's traditional working landscape and natural area features. They include low-density residential development, sometimes commercial development that's compatible with productive lands and natural areas. Agricultural and forestry areas, these are more larger blocks of forest or farmland that sustain resource industries. These areas can include housing as well, but they're just more sizable areas of uninterrupted forest or farmland. They also provide wildlife habitat, outdoor recreation, flood storage, aquifer recharge, and scenic beauty, and contribute to economy and quality of life. And then the final category is conservation. So these are areas intended to be conserved, often with regulations or state or nonprofit purchase of property rights. So any federal or state land or lands that have conservation easements on them would fall under rural conservation. These have significant ecological value and require special protections. But just to note, as I mentioned before, that these rural land use classifications are not used as a basis for Tier 3 designation under Act 250. So that's a separate rulemaking process. So even though Tier 3 talks about critical resource areas, and there will likely be a lot of overlap between Tier 3 and rural conservation, our mapping does not inform what will be Tier 3. So I wanted to show this is a very preliminary draft. We've started to do some of this mapping in the town of Brattleboro. So this is just showing downtown Brattleboro area. So on the left-hand side are the different land use categories that I just walked through. Only a few of them are shown here just because we're really focused on the downtown area. But you'll see in the darker shade of purple here is the designated downtown center for Brattleboro. The lighter purple surrounding that is planned growth area covering a lot of the existing development immediately around the downtown center. This yellowish area here is showing rural general, and then the kind of greenish blue here is rural agriculture and forestry. For those that are familiar with Brattleboro, this area is where the retreat farm has some of their trails going off from that property. So this just shows you, we really just started the mapping process for Act 2081, but I just wanted to show you what it's beginning to look like. The hatched area here, this is showing a mapped river corridor, and then underneath that is showing flood hazard areas. So as part of this process too, we are going to be showing river corridors and flood hazard areas as an overlay on top of those land use categories, because regulations regarding flood hazard areas and river corridors will still be in effect through this land use planning process and the updated future land use map. So next I want to talk about housing targets, which I've mentioned a couple times so far, but I wanted to go into more details about that. So the Home Act and Act 181 revised statute to include new requirements in the regional plan and for municipal plans regarding housing targets. The Vermont Housing and Finance Agency does a regular statewide housing needs assessment to identify the additional housing needed statewide. And they are now required to include regional housing targets. And these targets were published in January of 2025. And so each region in the state now has a housing target based on that housing needs assessment. The Home Act required that RPCs assign housing targets to each town in the region to add up to that region-wide housing production goal. And then once we complete that process, town plans, when they get updated, will need to include those housing target numbers and recommendations for how those housing targets could be reached. It's important to note these are just aspirational numbers, so there's not a mandate that the region or a town meet the housing targets. My sense is we're going through this process to identify the significant housing shortage that we have, and I think it helps kind of put a number on what that shortage is exactly, and to really underscore the significant need for more housing. But I do want to emphasize it's really just a goal for both us as a regional planning commission and for towns to achieve those housing targets. So this slide shows the regional housing targets developed by Vermont Housing Finance Authority. So for Wyndham Regional, it's shown in the red box outlined here. So the housing need assessment includes targets for the year 2030 and then out to the year 2050. And VHFA developed a lower and a upper target based on different population projections and other assumptions. So for our region, by 2030, the lower housing target was 2,571 units, and then the upper target was 3,730 units. And for 2050, it's about 7,900 for the lower target and 15,600 for the upper target for our entire region. And you can see too what the targets are for other regions and what the targets are statewide. These are very large numbers, and so it's going to take a lot of work to achieve those numbers. Just to give you a sense of, as I mentioned, Wyndham Regional is going to need to assign housing targets to each municipality to get to that region-wide number. So we're starting to develop a methodology for how we can do that. And our methodology will assign those goals based on a town's existing population, existing number of housing units, and we're just looking at occupied year-round dwellings because we have some towns that have a very high percentage of seasonal dwellings. And if this criteria was used looking at all housing units, then those towns with a lot of seasonal housing units may have a disproportionately high housing target. And then we're also considering the availability of public water and wastewater infrastructure that could accommodate more moderate and high density type residential developments that would help us achieve those targets more easily. And so this methodology, these different criteria will be weighted in developing the housing targets. And then as part of that public engagement, we're going to be doing with towns looking at the regional land use maps. We're also going to be reviewing the draft housing targets with towns so they understand how those numbers were arrived at, and we can make adjustments as needed. But again, I think it's important to remember that these are just goals. So, there's not going to be a requirement that that towns meet these goals because towns are limited in what they can do to create more housing. They can, provide the infrastructure and regulations to support housing, but towns are not able to go out and build all the housing that's required to meet these targets. So with that, I'll pause again, just to see if there are any questions. I saw a question in the chat box, so let me pull that up. So from Town of Londonderry, how does Act 181 affect bylaws currently being updated? So Act 181, as I mentioned, it does include some additional zoning preemptions. It's not as extensive as the preemptions included in the Home Act in 2023. A lot of what's in Act 181 is just cleaning up some of what was included in the Home Act and clarifying it. So similar with the Home Act, the zoning preemptions that went into effect with Act 181 now would supersede any local zoning bylaws. So if you have zoning bylaws that have not been updated to meet that Home Act requirements or Act 181 requirements, it's important to just be aware of those new requirements. And that's something I'm happy to follow up with Town of Londonderry on that, just about what those requirements are so that your zoning administrator, which I'm sure he is familiar with them, but just to make sure he's familiar with them. If I know Londonderry, I know that you're in the process of updating your zoning, so it is a good opportunity to make sure that the bylaws are up to date to meet the Home Act and Act 181 requirements. And so I'm happy to follow up with you about that. So hopefully that answers your question. And I see a question from Sue Coakley. How does Act 181 relate to the PUC's authority to approve the siting of energy facilities? That's a good question. I'm just thinking, I don't think there's anything in Act 181 that really changes the process that's in place today for the PUC. Yeah, I can't think of anything that would directly affect that. Yeah, not yeah, I think it doesn't have an impact on the PUC's process directly. Just checking to see if there are any other questions. If not, I've got a few more slides here. And then definitely we'll have time for questions at the end too. Continue on. So next I want to talk in more detail. I've talked about the relationship between the regional future land use map and Act 250 and the state designation program. So I just want to try to lay that out a little more clearly here too. So to review, we have our regional plan and our future land use map. And as part of that process, we're mapping downtown centers and village centers, planned growth areas, and village areas. Once the land use review board, the state land use review board, once they approve the regional plan and the future land use map, there will be an automatic state designation for the centers and neighborhoods depicted on the map. So that falls under the new revamped state designation program. So in addition, towns that have opted into Tier 1B for Act 250 will be designated as Tier 1B with the approval of the plan and map. And then with the approval of the plan and map, towns that want to apply for Tier 1A would then be eligible for applying for Tier 1A. So just to talk a little bit more about the state designation program. So as I mentioned, the program's been around for more than 25 years. It's evolved to add different designations over time. It's been very successful in bringing investment into village centers and downtowns. But there's also recognition that some of the designations can be challenging for towns to qualify for. And there was a recognition that if we have a goal statewide to try to invest within our centers, we should make the state designation program more accessible and easier for municipalities to obtain a designation. So in response to that, the number of designations was reduced from 5 to 2. So as I mentioned, there are now centers, and these are downtown centers and village centers mapped by the regional planning commissions. And then there are neighborhoods, which are planned growth areas and village areas. So I want to talk a little more about the centers. So for the center designation, there are going to be 3 steps of benefits, starting from step 1 and moving up to step 3. And depending on which step a center is at, there are different benefits for a town and also for property owners within that designated center. So step 1 is referred to kind of as the beginner starter village. So every village center that's mapped on the regional land use map as a village center will start off at step 1. Step 2 would include all existing village centers. So if your town has an existing village center, you would automatically be at step 2. And so there are some additional criteria for a town to move up from step 1 to step 2 if they're just starting at step 1. And then step 3 is really, it's the equivalent of our current designated downtown program. And so every existing downtown center, or every existing designated downtown would automatically be in step 3. And the types and the assistance of benefit for each step is still being defined by the Department of Housing and Community Development. And so there will be additional information coming out about those benefits. I know the Department of Housing and Community Development has some additional information on their website about those different steps. For the neighborhood designation, so this is a combination of neighborhood development areas and what were growth centers under the old designation program. And so they'll continue to receive many of the same benefits like tax credits through that program. However, the neighborhood development area program did used to include some permitting relief and exemptions from Act 250, and that's going to now be implemented through the Act 250 tiers rather than through the designation program. So the designation process, to review this again, so it starts with the RPCs mapping the centers, planned growth areas, and village areas. And then as part of that land use review board process, the Community Investment Board provides comments on proposed boundaries to make sure that what we are mapping meets the state criteria. Once the map is approved by the Land Use Review Board, the designations automatically go into effect. So there's no application process for towns. They receive that designation. And then the town, after the map is approved, the town works directly with the Department of Housing and Community Development to, take advantage of different benefits and also understand the steps, the process of going up the steps for the center designation, and to receive any technical assistance that they might need. So next I want to turn to the new framework for Act 250, and I'll walk through this. This is a lot of information here, but I'll walk through this with you. So again, Under the new framework for Act 250, there are three separate tiers. Tier 1 provides permit relief, and it's divided between Tier 1A and Tier 1B. So starting with Tier 1A on the left-hand side here, Tier 1A grants full Act 250 exemption. So to receive the Tier 1A designation, the area needs to be mapped as downtown or village center or planned growth area on the regional future land use map. So those are the only areas eligible for Tier 1A. And then there are some additional standards, including having zoning and subdivision bylaws that are functionally equivalent with the Act 250 standards, having public water and wastewater, and then adequate staff capacity to administer those bylaws. The municipality applies to the land use review board to receive that designation, so it's not automatic with the future land use map approval. The land use review board is still developing guidelines for Tier 1A in developing that application process, and that is required to be completed by January 1st of 2026. Moving to the next column, Tier 1B. So this is partial exemption to support additional housing development. So it's exemption for 50 units or less involving 10 acres or less of land. To receive this, you need to be mapped as downtown or village center, planned growth area, or village area. The town opts in. So when we're working with towns on reviewing future land use maps, if a community has a mapped center or planned growth area or village area, we will talk to the town about whether they want to opt into Tier 1B. It's entirely up to the town whether or not they want Tier 1B status. We will also work with the town to verify that they're eligible because there are some additional requirements for Tier 1B status. But if a town wants that designation, then that's something we include as part of our application to the Land Use Review Board, kind of a list of towns that are requesting Tier 1B status. A town can also, if you have multiple village centers in a town, or you had a downtown center and a village center, and you only wanted one of your centers to be Tier 1B, that's something a town could choose to do too, because it is location based. It's not town wide, but it's really just kind of a core area of the community that can support that additional development. Moving to the next column, Tier 2. So this is, I say it's essentially status quo. So the same requirements under Act 250 in terms of the size of the project apply. So any area that's not under Tier 1 or Tier 3 would remain Tier 2 under Act 250. There are some additional requirements requiring permitting under Act 250. This is known as the road rule, which goes into effect July 1st of 2026. So this applies to a project that involves a new single private road that's longer than 800 feet, or a network of roads and driveways more than 2,000 feet. The intention being trying to reduce the amount of forest fragmentation from new roads that are coming off of main roads and thoroughfares through a community. And then finally, Tier 3. So Tier 3 will include expanded jurisdiction for important natural resources areas. And this is going to be established through rulemaking by the Land Use Review Board, which needs to be done by February 1st of 2026. So again, Tier 3 is not based on our future land use map. At a minimum, the rules for Tier 3 need to address protection of river corridors, headwater streams, habitat connectors, riparian areas, Class A waters, and natural communities. So at a minimum, the Land Use Review Board will be including that in their rulemaking for Tier 3. So just to provide a little more information about the tiers. So again, Tier 1A, these are the areas eligible on our future land use map, downtown centers or village centers, and planned growth areas. It must be applied for by the municipality, and it's not approved with the approval of our land use map. So additional requirements are water and sewer with existing or planned capacity. They need to have smart growth zoning and bylaws that allow for up to 4 stories for building height. The bylaws, local bylaws need to protect environmentally sensitive areas and address historic preservation. And then there needs to be adequate municipal capacity in terms of staffing and capital planning for these areas. So if all those standards are met and the application approved, then that area is exempt from Act 250. Again, applications and rules will be available after January 1st of 2026 for Tier 1A. Tier 1B includes all the same areas under Tier 1A, and in addition to that, the village areas as well. And again, this is just for 50 units or fewer of housing on 10 acres or less. So a town needs to opt in. It needs to have adequate staffing and capacity to administer its bylaws. It does need to have zoning and subdivision bylaws. It does not need to have all the same infrastructure that Tier 1A does. It needs to have water, wastewater, or adequate soils to support more intense development. And then again, for Tier 2, all other future land use areas would fall under Tier 2. That includes if a downtown or village center, planned growth area, or village area. If a town doesn't want Tier 1A or Tier B, or it's not eligible, that would remain Tier 2. Again, the new road rule would apply to Tier 2. So again, it's largely status quo under Act 250. Our regional plan policies would still apply for an Act 250 permit, where we would be able to comment on that proposal based on our regional plan policies. And then Tier 3 is those areas of critical natural resources, not based on regional plan maps. So it's not the same as the rural conservation boundary. And that's going to be defined and mapped by the Land Use Review Board by February 1st of 2026. So just to note at the end of this process, there will be the regional future land use map, but there will also be a map showing Act 250 jurisdiction in which areas fall under these different tiers. So that'll be a separate map that's available too. So to wrap it up, I just wanted to, as we wrap up the discussion, and I'll turn on my video here, I wanted to end with this slide that I already presented earlier on, but I do think this is a helpful summary of everything that is happening under Act 181. There are a lot of different components, as you've seen just going through this presentation, but the intention is to try to create just a more comprehensive and integrated framework for planning in the state versus before where these efforts were kind of separate. This is trying to bring things all together just to make for a better planning process and for more efficiency, and to make it easier for towns to be eligible for some of these different benefits and exemptions under Act 250. I want to pause here. This is the last slide I have in the presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions. Jessica asked if I'll email the slides. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post the presentation, a PDF of the slides and the recording on our website, and hope to do that tomorrow. But if you can't find them for any reason, let me know and I'll email you the slides too. I recognize it's, yeah, a lot of information, so it can be helpful to go back and take a look at this. As I mentioned too at the beginning, this is meant as an overview and introduction of Act 181 and the implications for our regional plan and our plan for working with towns. So we're going to be doing a lot more work with each town beginning in the fall. Let's see, Patty has a question. How are planned growth areas planned and designated? So for planned growth areas, let me go back to, just bear with me, I'll go back to that slide. So for planned growth areas, and some of what's included on this slide is taken from statute, and some of it is more just providing some context. For these 10 new land use categories, each is defined in statute now, kind of the goal and purpose of those land use categories. And for some of the land use categories, including planned growth area, there are more specific criteria, just because this is one of the areas where the state, or through the legislation, the state wants to encourage more growth. The criteria and definition for planned growth area is more detailed than rural general, for example, because I think the intention was to make sure that if growth is going to happen within a planned growth area, there's a framework in place to make sure that it's happening in a way that's consistent with statewide planning goals. A planned growth area is going to be designated. Our mapping process will be looking at how statute defines a planned growth area and the criteria. And then we'll be, with the draft mapping process, mapping out those areas in the region that meet the planned growth area designation. And then working with towns to review that to make sure that that's consistent with kind of their goals for the area. We do in this process, because these land use categories are defined in statute, and we will need to go to the land use review board for approval of the plan. We do need to make sure that what we're mapping is consistent with the statute language. We'll work with towns to refine the future land use map based on kind of their goals too, but at the same time, we need to make sure we're still meeting the statute requirements. It's what, like I said, we'll be drafting the maps, which will include planned growth areas, but then we'll be asking for input from towns about that, and whether or not that's consistent with what they want to see.
Matt, can I add on to that a little bit? My question, for those towns that have had issues with flooding and are raising questions about their village centers and where that needs to exist and or future be, I gather this planned growth area might dovetail into that or not? Is that separate?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's opportunities through planned growth area, downtown centers and village centers and village areas, to identify areas that are not yet developed, but that are immediately adjacent to a center or a existing neighborhood that's adjacent to a center. Because the idea is, right, for a lot of communities, their existing center is within a flood risk area, and so we don't want to direct all that growth within areas that are flood prone. So part of the mapping process will allow us to identify undeveloped areas immediately next to those existing centers that could accommodate more growth. And then it'll be a question of, what's the appropriate designation? Is it planned growth area, village area, expanded village center? So that's something we'll have to work out with towns, just kind of the best designation. But yeah, it does provide for kind of future planning. It's not just mapping existing conditions, but allows for, what we want to see in the future as well. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, super helpful. Thanks.
See. And let me check. Any other questions at this point? Feel free to just chime in or use the chat box. And I'm also happy to, if you have follow-up questions after tonight, I'm happy to try and answer those. It's a big piece of legislation that we're all getting familiar with. So it's definitely been a learning process for us too. So if there's nothing else, like I said, I'll work on getting this posted tomorrow and posting the slides too. So I would encourage you to share it with others in your community.